A silent journey of kindness. It was an ordinary evening in the city, quiet, almost serene. The streets echoed with the hum of people winding down from their daily activities, the sounds of distant laughter, soft chatter, and the occasional honking of a car drifting through the air. The golden glow of sunset painted the sky in a brilliant mix of oranges, pinks, and purples, casting long shadows on the pavements. The city was alive, but there was a certain stillness in the atmosphere, as if the world had paused for a brief moment, offering a moment of peace. Among the ordinary citizens walking the streets that evening, there was one man who stood out, not by his appearance, but by the quiet, almost invisible way he blended into the flow of life. Keanu Reeves, the man who had become a household name worldwide, walked through the streets like a shadow. His signature hoodie, pulled low over his head, shielded his identity. He was no longer the larger-than-life action hero, the stoic figure from iconic movies. Tonight, he was just a man among the people, seeking nothing but connection with the world around him. There was no crowd of fans following him, no flashing lights from paparazzi cameras. In fact, most of the people on the street didn't even notice him at first. Keanu wasn't here for the recognition. He wasn't here for the limelight or the constant spotlight that had defined his career. This was not a performance for him. It was a journey of the heart. As Keanu walked deeper into the heart of the city, a soft, melodic sound caught his attention, a rhythm that echoed through the air and seemed to reach out to him in a way he hadn't expected. It was a call, distinct yet gentle, filled with reverence. The sound of the call to prayer. Curious, Keanu followed the sound, drawn in by the peaceful resonance of the voice. His feet guided him instinctively toward its source, and before long, he found himself standing at the entrance of a mosque. Its minaret stretched gracefully into the evening sky, glowing faintly under the streetlights. The doors were open, and inside, a steady stream of people entered, their faces calm and focused, each carrying a sense of peace and devotion. Keanu hesitated for a moment. He had never set foot in a mosque before, but the sight of the people entering, each one so serene, their movements deliberate, and filled with purpose, stirred something inside him. It was a feeling of unity, of belonging, and perhaps even of discovery. Without thinking too much about it, he took a step forward, entering the mosque as quietly as he had approached it. The atmosphere inside was different, calm, reverent. The air was thick with the fragrance of incense and the soft murmur of prayers. The room was filled with worshippers, all deeply focused on their prayers, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of the call to prayer. Keanu stood at the back, uncertain of where to go or what to do, but he felt a pull, an invitation from the space itself. He didn't want to disturb anyone or draw attention to himself, so he found a quiet corner and sat down. As the prayers continued, Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, letting the atmosphere envelop him. The peacefulness of the room was like nothing he had ever experienced before. The worries and distractions of the world seemed to melt away, and for a brief moment, Keanu felt a profound sense of belonging. A reminder that despite the fame and fortune, he too was just a human being in search of meaning, connection, and understanding. Time seemed to stand still as Keanu sat there, lost in the moment. The prayers, the unity of the community, the shared purpose, all of it left him with a deep sense of humility. He had always admired the strength and perseverance of people in difficult circumstances, but tonight he was witnessing something entirely different. He was witnessing the power of faith, of devotion, and of kindness in a way he had never fully appreciated before. As the prayer session came to an end, the worshippers began to rise from their positions. Keanu stood as well, not wanting to intrude, but not wanting to leave either. He was overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment, and he felt compelled to do something, anything, that might express his gratitude for this experience. At that moment, the mosque's imam, a kind-looking man in his late 50s, noticed Keanu in the corner of the room. He had been so absorbed in the prayers that he hadn't seen the famous actor enter, But now that he did, he smiled warmly. There was no shock, no overwhelming reaction, just a calm, welcoming smile that seemed to convey understanding. He approached Keanu slowly, his steps measured, as if he were walking toward a fellow seeker rather than a celebrity. "Peace be upon you," the imam said softly, his voice gentle but firm, as though offering a bridge of connection between them. Keanu looked up, his heart swelling with emotion at the simplicity and warmth in the imam's eyes. "Peace be upon you as well," Keanu replied, his voice quiet but sincere. The imam looked around the mosque for a moment before turning his attention back to Keanu. "I don't know if you've visited before, but this is a place where anyone, regardless of who they are, can find peace." Keanu nodded slowly, grateful for the imam's words. There was no need for pleasantries, no need to explain why he had come. He simply felt drawn to this space, a space where he wasn't an actor, an icon, or a public figure. He was just another human being seeking something beyond the superficial. "I've never been here before," Keanu admitted, "but something about the call, it pulled me in." The imam smiled again, this time a bit more knowingly. The call to prayer is a reminder for us all to pause, to reflect, and to remember that there is something greater than ourselves. It's a powerful thing, that call. It doesn't matter where we come from, what we have, or who we think we are. It's about the moment. Keanu's heart ached at the simplicity of the words. It was a message he had always known, but hearing it in this quiet space, from someone who lived it daily, gave it a new depth. As the evening continued and the mosque began to empty, Keanu sat for a while longer. He observed the people around him, all of them so different, yet so alike in their shared moments of devotion. He saw elderly men bowing in prayer, young children sitting with their parents, their faces full of innocence and curiosity. And he saw individuals like him, just people trying to find their way in a world that often felt too big, too chaotic, and too overwhelming. Keanu didn't rush to leave. In fact, he sat in the mosque for hours, reflecting on his own journey, on the lives he had touched and those who had touched his. He thought about the struggles he had faced in his life, his losses, his challenges, the moments where the weight of the world had threatened to crush him. And yet, here he was, in a place where none of that mattered. He was just a man among others, sharing in the quiet beauty of a moment. By the time Keanu left the mosque, the city had grown still. The streets were quieter now, with fewer people around. But Keanu didn't feel lonely. He felt something deeper, something more profound. The experience had left him changed. It wasn't about the recognition or the fame. It was about something much more lasting. A connection to something greater, something that transcended the world of celebrity and fame. As Keanu walked back through the empty streets, he felt lighter. The weight of his own worries seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to hide behind the layers of fame or expectation. He was just Keanu, just a man walking through the world, trying to find meaning, trying to make sense of it all. And as he turned the corner, he knew that this night, this quiet act of kindness and reflection, would stay with him for a long time. It was a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful experiences come not from what you take, but from what you give, whether it's a moment of kindness, a shared understanding, or simply the humility to step into a new space and be open to something different. This was just the beginning of Keanu's journey into something deeper, something beyond the life he had always known. And little did he know, the community he had touched that night would never forget the humble man who walked into their mosque, not for recognition, but for the simple act of seeking peace, a moment of reflection. The night had settled fully over the city as Keanu made his way back through the quiet streets. The distant sounds of city life seemed muffled now, like a soft hum beneath the weight of his thoughts. He walked with purpose, but not in the hurried, goal-driven way of someone trying to reach a destination. No, this was different. This walk was slower, more deliberate, almost meditative. The world around him seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the present moment. Keanu's mind replayed the events at the mosque, the way the call to prayer had resonated deep within him. The Imam's words echoed in his thoughts. It's about the moment. In the vast, overwhelming expanse of life, where everything moves so quickly, those words had struck a chord. They were simple, yet profound. It was a reminder that no matter how much we accumulate, whether it's wealth, fame, or even experiences, the truest sense of peace comes when we stop chasing and simply be. The evening had left Keanu with a sense of humility. In the midst of his busy life, filled with filming, interviews, and the constant buzz of Hollywood, he had somehow forgotten the importance of being still. He realized that for all the accolades and applause, there was always a piece of him that yearned for something more, something real, something rooted in shared human experience. And that night, for the first time in what felt like years, Keanu had found that stillness, that peace in a mosque, among a community he had never met before. But as much as the experience had been deeply personal for him, Keanu couldn't shake the thought of the community he had witnessed. He had come to the mosque as a stranger, yet they had welcomed him without question. Their faces had been filled with kindness, understanding, and peace. They had no idea who he was, but to them, he was just another human being, seeking the same answers to life's most fundamental questions. Keanu realized that in that simplicity lay the power of true connection. There was no need for pretense, no need for status, just people living side by side, each with their own struggles and joys. As he continued his walk, Keanu's mind wandered to the idea of kindness. It seemed so simple, yet so often overlooked. In his world, kindness was sometimes drowned out by the noise of competition and the chase for success. But here, in that mosque, kindness had been offered freely, without hesitation. It wasn't about what anyone could gain, but about a shared sense of humanity, of looking out for one another, of creating a space where everyone felt welcome and valued. Keanu stopped at a small park along the way, a quiet green space tucked away from the main road. He sat down on a bench, his eyes drawn to the gentle sway of the trees in the night breeze. The leaves whispered secrets in the wind, and Keanu closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. It was then that he thought about his own journey. His career had taken him all over the world, and he had encountered many people from different walks of life. But despite the accolades and recognition, Keanu had often felt disconnected, as though he were living in a world of his own, a world where true connection seemed just out of reach. The Hollywood scene was filled with smiles, handshakes, and red carpets, but how much of it was real? How many people he had met over the years had truly seen him for who he was, not just as a famous actor? The constant pressures to maintain an image, to live up to expectations, had left him feeling isolated at times. And yet here, in the presence of strangers, he had felt something far more genuine. No one had cared who he was, what he had accomplished, or how much money he made. They had simply accepted him as a person, and in that acceptance he had found something he had long been searching for, a sense of belonging. As Keanu sat there, reflecting on the kindness of the mosque community, he realized that this moment, this simple, humble experience, had reminded him of the most important lesson of all, that the true measure of a person was not in their achievements or their fame, but in how they treated others, especially those who could offer nothing in return. It was in the quiet acts of kindness, the unspoken gestures of understanding, and the shared moments of connection that the human spirit was most profoundly expressed. Keanu felt a shift within himself. He had always believed in the power of kindness, but tonight, he had experienced it in a way that left him forever changed. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring him to that mosque, to that moment, to show him a truth he had known all along but had not fully embraced until now. The simple act of being kind to one another, of offering compassion without expecting anything in return, was the key to true happiness and fulfillment. It was in this realization that Keanu found a new sense of purpose. For years, he had been focused on his career, on the next movie, the next project, the next big thing. But now he knew that there was more to life than just professional success. There was a deeper calling, one that transcended the superficial aspects of fame and fortune. He didn't need to change the world, but he could make it a little better, one act of kindness at a time. As the night wore on, Keanu felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He knew that his journey wasn't over, that there was still much to discover, but he also understood that this moment, the one he had experienced in the mosque, was just the beginning of something far greater than he could have imagined. It was the beginning of a deeper connection to the world around him, to the people he would meet along the way, and to the quiet, profound acts of kindness that had the power to change everything. With a newfound sense of clarity, Keanu stood up from the bench and began walking again. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he no longer felt the need to have all the answers. All he knew was that he was ready to live more fully, to embrace every moment with openness and kindness, and to give more of himself to the world. In the days that followed, Keanu kept thinking about that evening. He continued to visit the mosque on occasion, not because he felt obligated, but because he felt drawn to it, a place where the quiet power of faith, humility, and compassion had left an indelible mark on his heart. It became a sanctuary for him, a space where he could reflect on his journey and find solace in the simplicity of being present. And as he walked through life, Keanu found that the lessons of that evening stayed with him, guiding his actions, his thoughts, and his interactions with others. It was a subtle shift, but one that made all the difference. He had come to realize that the true measure of a life well lived was not in the applause or the recognition, but in the quiet, meaningful moments that touched the hearts of others. The more he lived with this understanding, the more he began to see the world in a new light. People, no matter their background or circumstances, all shared the same fundamental need for connection and understanding. And it was in those moments of shared kindness, no matter how small, that the human spirit truly soared. The ripple of compassion. Keanu's life had always been a whirlwind of red carpets, flashing lights, and the unrelenting pace of Hollywood. But since that quiet night at the mosque, something had shifted deep within him. The world, which had once seemed so vast and intimidating, now felt more interconnected, like an intricate web of shared experiences and human connections. The truths he had discovered about kindness, humility, and the power of simple moments had ignited a quiet revolution in his heart. He no longer sought the applause or recognition that had once seemed so important. Instead, he found himself drawn to the quieter spaces, places where connection was formed not through words, but through presence. Days turned into weeks, and Keanu began to find new ways to incorporate the lessons from the mosque into his everyday life. It wasn't always easy, of course. The demands of his career were still present, and the pressures of the public eye didn't disappear overnight. But now, he faced those challenges with a new perspective. Each day became an opportunity for small acts of kindness, whether it was taking a moment to listen to someone's story, offering a word of encouragement to a colleague, or simply showing patience in a world that often felt rushed. It was during one of these small moments that Keanu had his first real encounter with someone whose life had been touched by his work, not as a movie star, but as a human being. He had been in a cafe, enjoying a rare moment of solitude, when a woman in her 30s approached him hesitantly. Keanu had already noticed her glancing his way from the corner of his eye, but she had been careful not to stare, her gaze flicking away whenever their eyes met. Keanu looked up from his cup of coffee, offering her a warm, genuine smile. "Hi there," he said, his voice kind but unassuming. The woman, startled by his approach, took a small step forward. Her hands fidgeted nervously as she smiled back, her voice soft but clear. "I hope it's okay to say this," she began, "but I've always admired you, not just as an actor, but as a person." Keanu tilted his head slightly, sensing that there was more to her story. "Thank you," he replied, his tone inviting. "What do you mean by that?" The woman hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I was in a really dark place a few years ago. I lost my job, My relationship ended, and I felt like I was losing myself. But then one day, I saw one of your interviews. You spoke about the importance of kindness, of staying true to yourself, even when things feel hard. It really struck me. I was so lost, but your words gave me the strength to keep going. Keanu's heart ached as he listened to her words. She wasn't the first person who had been impacted by his interviews, but hearing it in person, from someone who had been through her own struggles, made it feel more real. The kindness he had tried to cultivate in his own life, the message of humility he had learned through his experiences, had resonated with this woman, enough to help her find a way through her own pain. "I'm glad my words helped you," Keanu said, his voice full of sincerity. "But I want you to know, you're the one who found the strength to move forward. It wasn't me. It was always inside you." The woman smiled, her eyes shining with unused tears. "Maybe," she said softly, "but you helped me see that it was okay to ask for help, to not be afraid to reach out when I was struggling. I don't think I would have had the courage to turn things around if I hadn't heard you speak that day." Keanu nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for this unexpected moment of connection. It was one thing to be admired from afar, to be seen as a hero on the big screen, but it was something entirely different to hear that his actions, his words, had made a real impact in someone's life. "I'm really glad to hear you're doing better," Keanu said, his eyes reflecting the same warmth he had felt when he first entered the mosque. Genuine, heartfelt warmth. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We're all in this together." The woman's face softened, a tear slipping down her cheek as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered before walking away, her footsteps lighter than when she had approached him. As she disappeared into the bustling cafe, Keanu sat there for a while, reflecting on their brief exchange. It was moments like these that made the hardships and struggles of his career feel inconsequential. In this woman's story, he had seen the quiet power of vulnerability, the strength that came from sharing one's struggles and accepting help along the way. Keanu was reminded of a simple truth: kindness had a ripple effect. It wasn't about grand gestures or world-changing acts of heroism. It was in the small, quiet moments that true change happened. A single act of compassion could shift the course of someone's life, even if that shift was barely perceptible. And that ripple could continue to spread, touching others in ways that no one could predict. That thought lingered with him as he left the cafe and walked through the streets, now familiar and comforting in their quiet beauty. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't wear a cape or save the world from villains. But in that moment, Keanu understood that the greatest heroes were often those who simply showed up for others, who offered kindness and support without expecting anything in return. In the weeks that followed, Keanu began to see this ripple of compassion spreading in other areas of his life. On the set of his latest film, he made a conscious effort to engage with everyone, from the directors and producers to the crew members who often worked behind the scenes. He took the time to learn their names, to ask about their families, their dreams, and their passions. In doing so, he created an environment where people felt seen and heard, where the simple act of acknowledging another person's humanity became a powerful force for connection. But it wasn't just on the set. Keanu began to find other ways to incorporate this sense of compassion into his daily life. He started volunteering at local shelters, offering his time and resources to those in need. He visited hospitals and spent time with patients, listening to their stories and offering them encouragement. He didn't make a spectacle of his acts of kindness, but they were genuine, coming from a place of deep empathy and understanding. What Keanu found, time and again, was that the more he gave, the more he received. The simple act of showing up for someone else, of being present in their moment of need, had a profound effect, not just on those he helped, but on him as well. It was as though each act of kindness planted a seed, and over time, those seeds began to bloom, creating a garden of connection and love. One evening, as Keanu sat in his quiet apartment reflecting on his journey, he realized that he had found a new sense of purpose. He no longer needed to search for validation from the outside world. He no longer needed the recognition or fame that had once driven him. The real reward came from the joy of seeing others light up when they felt truly seen, truly cared for. And just as the woman in the cafe had said, the small acts of kindness he had given had created ripples, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. In this simple truth, Keanu found the key to a life well lived, not through accolades or achievements, but through the quiet, unspoken moments of compassion that connected him to others in ways that transcended the superficial. As he gazed out the window at the city lights below, Keanu smiled to himself. The journey had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The ripple of compassion he had started was far from over. It was just beginning, and he was ready to see where it would take him next. The power of presence. The weeks following Keanu's life-changing visit to the mosque had unfolded with an unexpected quietude. His actions, though filled with intention and a deep sense of reflection, seemed to draw little attention. He didn't seek the limelight. In fact, he felt more fulfilled by the subtle ways his life was shifting. In his heart, he knew something important had taken place, something that wasn't just about his own growth, but something far more profound. A deeper sense of peace had settled into his life, one that had been missing for years. Keanu had always been known as a man of few words. His stoic presence on screen was matched by his real-life demeanor, often reserved and reflective. But recently, he had become more attuned to the simple act of being present, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally present with those around him. It wasn't about grand gestures or flashy displays. It was about giving people his full attention, showing them that they mattered, not for their status or their profession, but for their inherent humanity. Keanu realized that sometimes all people needed was someone who truly listened, someone who offered not advice, but their presence, their time. It was on one of these quiet afternoons, when he had decided to visit a small coffee shop he frequented to reflect and catch up on reading, that the next unexpected moment of connection happened. He had been sitting by the window, watching the world go by, his thoughts a swirl of gratitude for the lessons he had learned, when a familiar figure walked in. It was an elderly man, walking with the aid of a cane, and his face was a mix of wrinkles and stories, lines carved by years of laughter, loss, and everything in between. He moved slowly, methodically, as though every step was a deliberate decision. As he approached the counter, Keanu noticed the man's hesitant gaze as he fumbled for his wallet. It was clear that the old man was struggling, and the barista behind the counter, though young and well-meaning, wasn't immediately aware of the challenge. Without thinking, Keanu stood up from his seat and walked over to the counter. The elderly man looked up in surprise as Keanu gently placed his hand on his shoulder. "Allow me," Keanu said, offering a reassuring smile. The elderly man blinked up at him, his eyes wide with both gratitude and a hint of surprise. You don't need to, son," he said, his voice soft but shaky, the weight of years in his words. Keanu's smile remained steady. "It's no trouble at all." As he helped the elderly man pay for his coffee and place the order, Keanu was struck by how often people overlooked those who seemed less able, less visible. The elderly, the disabled, those who didn't fit into society's notion of productivity or success, often faded into the background. Yet, in that moment, with the old man standing there and the world around them moving so quickly, Keanu realized that sometimes the most meaningful moments came from stopping, slowing down, and paying attention to what was right in front of you. As they moved to the side to wait for the coffee, the elderly man introduced himself as Robert. They exchanged pleasantries, but Keanu could tell that Robert wasn't the type of man who often shared his story with strangers. Still, Keanu felt drawn to him, sensing that there was something more beneath the surface. He sat down with him at a nearby table, and without the need to push for answers, simply allowed the conversation to flow. And in that space of quiet, unspoken understanding, Robert began to open up. "I used to be a teacher," Robert said, his eyes lighting up a bit at the memory. "History. I loved every moment of it. Sharing stories, inspiring young minds. But that was years ago. Now, he trailed off, his eyes clouding for a brief moment. Now it's just me and my thoughts. Keanu nodded thoughtfully, not pushing for more, but letting the silence stretch between them, giving Robert room to continue if he chose. I don't have much family left. Just a niece who calls every now and then. But she's busy. She's got a life of her own. A family. I don't want to burden her. Robert's voice wavered slightly as he spoke, a trace of loneliness beneath his words. It was a feeling Keanu recognized all too well. The isolation that comes when you're no longer the person people call upon for help, but the one in need. Keanu took a deep breath, his own heart aching for this man who had spent his life enriching others, and now found himself alone. He didn't know what to say at first, but then the simple truth of his own experiences came to him. Those quiet moments in the mosque had taught him that sometimes all someone needed was to be truly seen, to be heard without judgment, without advice, just for who they were. I know what you mean, Keanu said softly, his voice carrying a genuine warmth. Sometimes it feels like everyone else is moving so fast, and you're just trying to keep up. But it's hard when you feel like you're running out of time. But Robert, your story matters. You matter. The fact that you were a teacher, that you've touched the lives of so many, that's a legacy that doesn't fade. You've left an imprint on this world that's more significant than you might realize. Robert looked at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Keanu's face, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible nod, he gave a small, grateful smile. You know, he said after a pause, I haven't heard anyone say something like that to me in a long time. It's easy to forget, sometimes, when you're on your own for so long. Keanu smiled back, a smile that was not for the cameras, not for the audience, but for this moment. A moment shared with a stranger who wasn't a stranger anymore, but a fellow human being. I think a lot of people forget, Keanu replied. It's easy to feel invisible in this world, but you're not. The elderly man's coffee arrived, and he sat quietly for a moment, sipping it, as if savoring the warmth both in the cup and in the exchange they had just shared. Keanu stayed with him for a while longer, and they talked about everything and nothing. Life, the passage of time, memories from the past, and the present moments that often slipped away unnoticed. But for both of them, it was enough to just sit together in the quiet, in the company of someone who understood the simple power of presence. When Keanu eventually stood to leave, he placed a hand on Robert's shoulder again, this time with a feeling of quiet reverence. I hope I'll see you again, Robert, Keanu said with a sincere smile. Robert looked up at him, his face softened by the kindness, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed to stand a little taller. You take care, son. Thank you. Keanu nodded, and as he left the coffee shop, he realized how much the simple act of being present had meant to both of them. There were no grand gestures, no spectacular achievements. Just two people taking the time to truly see one another, to share a moment of genuine connection. And in that connection, something powerful had been sparked. Not just in Robert, but in Keanu as well. Walking back through the streets of the city, Keanu reflected on the power of being present. It wasn't about trying to fix someone's problems or offering solutions. It was about listening, truly listening, and giving someone the gift of attention, of presence. That was where the healing began, not in grand words, but in quiet, unspoken understanding. Keanu's journey was far from over. In fact, he realized it was just beginning. The lessons of humility, kindness, and presence would guide him as he moved forward. And he knew that the ripples of compassion he had set in motion would continue to spread, touching lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The silent gifts. Keanu Reeves had always been an enigma to those who admired him from afar. His reserved nature and quiet demeanor set him apart from the usual Hollywood stars, who often found themselves the center of attention, basking in the adoration of fans and the press. But Keanu was different. There was an unmistakable humility about him that made him stand out, not because of the fame he carried, but because of the quiet, steady way he moved through the world. Yet it wasn't until the events of the past few months, after his visit to the mosque, that he began to fully understand the depth of the journey he was on. Not the one in front of the cameras, but the one in his heart. The lessons he had learned were like silent gifts. They weren't flashy or attention-grabbing, but they were profound in their simplicity. The ability to listen without judgment, to offer kindness without expectation, to show up for others without seeking recognition. These were the true measures of a life well lived. And Keanu was beginning to realize that this was the path he wanted to walk from here on out. As he continued to reflect on the impact of his small acts of compassion, he realized something else. The more he embraced this new way of being, the more he found himself surrounded by people who were drawn to that same energy. It wasn't just about giving kindness. It was about creating a space for others to feel that same warmth, that same connection. People weren't just responding to the acts themselves. They were responding to the invitation to be more present in their own lives, to live with the same awareness that Keanu was now striving for. One crisp morning, while Keanu was on his way to a film set, he encountered a familiar face, a woman who worked as a local barista at a cafe he had visited a few times, where he'd often gone to write or gather his thoughts. She was a quiet soul, not one to seek attention or make a fuss, but there was something about her energy that always made Keanu feel like he was in the right place when he came in. Her name was Sarah, and over time they had exchanged the occasional hello, nothing more than polite pleasantries. Today, however, as Keanu approached the counter, Sarah was waiting for him with a hesitant look on her face. She had always greeted him with a smile before, but there was something different today. An uncertainty in her eyes, as though she was grappling with something much larger than a simple morning order. Keanu stepped forward, his usual calm smile lighting up his face. "Good morning, Sarah. Everything all right?" Sarah glanced up at him, the weight of something unspoken lingering in her gaze. "Actually, Keanu, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about it for a while now, and I don't really know how to say it." Her voice trembled slightly, but there was a depth to it that caught Keanu's attention. Keanu's smile faded into a more gentle expression, his eyes softening as he met her gaze. "You don't have to explain anything if you don't want to," he said quietly. "But if you feel like sharing, I'm here." She let out a long breath, visibly relieved that Keanu hadn't pressured her to speak. I've been struggling lately. My mom is sick, and it's been really hard to juggle work and care for her at the same time. I feel like I'm failing both her and myself, you know. I'm doing my best, but some days it feels like I'm just barely holding it together. And I guess I'd just been looking for someone to say that it's okay, that I'm doing enough." Keanu's heart softened as he listened, understanding that this was more than just a passing conversation. This was someone who had been carrying a heavy burden in silence, and now she was reaching out to someone who had, unknowingly, been a source of comfort to her in the past. The simplicity of her request, to hear that she was doing enough, resonated deeply with Keanu. He could sense the weight she was carrying, and he knew how much it meant to hear those words when the world seemed to demand more than what anyone could give. "I can't imagine how tough it must be," Keanu said, his voice steady and warm. "But from what I know, Sarah, you're doing more than enough. Sometimes we forget that taking care of ourselves is just as important as taking care of others. It's okay to not have all the answers, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed. What you're doing matters. Your mom is lucky to have you." Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and for a moment, the cafe around them seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them in that small space, two people connected by the shared experience of being human, of struggling and striving in a world that didn't always make room for vulnerability. "I don't know what I would have done without those words," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking as she wiped away a tear. "I've been so caught up in the pressure, and I've been so afraid of not doing enough. But hearing you say that, it's like a weight has been lifted." Keanu offered her a gentle smile, the same one he had given so many times before, but now it carried more meaning than it ever had. "You're doing more than enough," he repeated. "You just need to remember that it's okay to ask for help when you need it. You don't have to do it all on your own." The interaction, though brief, was a turning point for Sarah. It was a quiet act of compassion, a recognition of her struggle, and a reminder that she wasn't alone. It wasn't the kind of moment that would make headlines or be remembered by many, but for Sarah, it was the kind of connection that could change the course of her day, and possibly even her life. As Keanu left the cafe that morning, he couldn't help but reflect on the way small acts of kindness could shift a person's entire perspective. He had spent so much of his life in a world that demanded perfection, that sought accomplishments and accolades, that he had never truly understood the importance of the small, silent moments. The moments that weren't shared for the sake of fame or recognition, but simply for the sake of connection. As he walked down the street, Keanu realized that this was the true reward of his journey, not the external recognition, not the fame, but the ability to make a difference in someone's life, even if it was in a way that no one else would ever see. These quiet acts of kindness, these moments of presence, were the gifts he had always longed to give. And in the giving, he had found something even more precious: peace. In the days that followed, Keanu continued to build on the foundation he had begun to lay. He kept reaching out to people in subtle ways, making space for their struggles, their triumphs, and their moments of vulnerability. He knew that the work wasn't easy, and that the impact of his actions wouldn't always be immediately apparent. But it didn't matter. He had found something more meaningful than fame or fortune in these simple exchanges. He had found a way to be truly present in the lives of others, and in doing so, he had discovered the power of silence, the kind of silence that spoke louder than any words could. And so, Keanu continued his journey, knowing that each small act of kindness he offered was a step toward a more compassionate world. The ripple effects of those silent gifts would continue to spread, quietly but steadily, touching lives in ways both big and small. The unseen paths. The journey Keanu Reeves had embarked upon, one that began with a simple, humble visit to a mosque during Ramadan, had evolved into something far deeper than he had ever expected. It had been a quiet transformation, one that neither sought attention nor recognition, but instead sought connection, understanding, and peace. The lessons of humility, kindness, and presence had reshaped his life in ways that felt organic, like roots slowly taking hold and growing in unexpected directions. The past few months had brought Keanu into the lives of many strangers, each with their own story to tell. Each encounter, each moment of connection, had left an imprint on his soul, and in turn, he had offered his presence in return. It wasn't always easy, nor was it always straightforward. There were days when he felt tired, days when the demands of his public life felt like they might overshadow the quiet path he was trying to walk. But even on those days, he found solace in knowing that the acts of kindness, the small moments of listening, and the unspoken understanding he offered were, in some ways, shaping the world around him. It was on one of these days, when the weight of the world outside felt a little heavier than usual, that Keanu decided to take a break. He had just finished filming a particularly grueling scene, and was feeling the exhaustion that came with long hours on set. He needed to clear his mind, and there was a place he had come to love. A small park on the outskirts of the city that had become his sanctuary. It was a quiet, peaceful space where he could sit and be still, far from the noise and chaos of the world he often inhabited. As Keanu arrived at the park, he noticed something different. There was a small crowd gathered near the entrance, a group of people standing in a circle, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Keanu, ever the observer, felt a pull to go over and see what was happening. He wasn't one to intrude, but something about the scene drew him in. As he approached, he could hear the hushed voices of the crowd, their murmurs rising with uncertainty. "What's going on?" Keanu asked gently, addressing a woman who stood just outside the circle. She looked at him briefly, and then, recognizing him, her eyes softened with a mix of surprise and recognition. "Oh, it's a man," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "He's been sitting here for a few days now. He looks homeless, but he hasn't said anything. He just sits on the bench, staring out at the trees. We think he might be in need of help, but no one knows what to do." Keanu looked past the woman toward the center of the group. There, on a worn bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree, sat a man who appeared to be in his mid-50s. His clothes were threadbare, his face weathered and tired. Yet there was a calmness in his eyes, a quiet sadness that seemed to reflect the weariness of life. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't asked for help, and yet the crowd had gathered, unsure of how to reach out to him. Keanu took a deep breath. This moment felt like a test, a chance to truly practice what he had been learning over the months. The temptation was there to simply walk away, to leave the crowd to their own devices, but something inside him urged him to approach, to offer the same presence he had offered others on his journey. He stepped into the circle, his movements slow and deliberate. As he walked closer to the man, the crowd parted, giving him space to approach. The man didn't seem to notice Keanu at first. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his expression distant. But Keanu sat down next to him, not saying anything, simply taking a seat and allowing the silence to stretch between them. Minutes passed, and the man still didn't acknowledge him. But Keanu wasn't in a hurry. He knew this wasn't a moment that could be rushed. So he sat quietly, letting the weight of the silence settle around them. He didn't press the man for answers, didn't ask him why he was there or what he needed. He simply offered his presence, knowing that sometimes that was all a person really needed, someone to share the space with them, without judgment, without expectation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke. His voice was low and hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in a long time. "You're not like the others," he said, his words quiet but clear. "They just stare at me, make their assumptions, whisper about what they think I need. But you just sat down next to me." Keanu turned his head slowly to look at the man. His eyes were tired, but there was a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken, something Keanu recognized. He smiled softly, not with any sense of superiority or pity, but with the kind of compassion that came from understanding. "Sometimes," Keanu said gently, "people just need someone to sit with them. Not to fix anything, but just to be there." The man blinked, his eyes seeming to focus more clearly on Keanu for the first time. There was a long pause, and then the man nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but enough to signify something had shifted. "I've been running for a long time," the man said, his voice cracking slightly. "Running from the life I had, from the mistakes I made. I ended up here, in this park, because it's the only place I feel like I can breathe. But even here, I don't feel like I belong. It's hard to let people in when you've lost everything." Keanu listened carefully, his gaze steady and patient. He didn't interrupt the man's story, didn't rush to offer solutions or advice. He simply allowed the man to speak, to release the burden he had been carrying alone for so long. "We all carry burdens," Keanu said softly after a while, "whether we're aware of them or not. Sometimes it takes a while to let go of them, to stop running, but it's never too late to start again." The man looked at Keanu, his expression shifting, as though he was processing something deep within. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "You don't know what I've done." Keanu smiled gently, his eyes filled with understanding. "No, I don't. But I do know that everyone deserves a chance to start over. And sometimes it takes someone reaching out to remind us of that." For the first time in what seemed like forever, the man looked at Keanu and offered a small, fragile smile, a smile that spoke more than words ever could. "I think I could use a little help," the man said, his voice still shaky, but there was a flicker of hope in it. "I don't know where to start, but maybe it's time." Keanu nodded, placing a hand gently on the man's shoulder. We all have a starting point, and sometimes all it takes is taking that first step, knowing that you don't have to do it alone. The crowd that had been watching from a distance slowly began to approach, drawn in by the exchange. Keanu didn't focus on them, didn't worry about what they thought. He was focused on the man beside him, the small spark of change that had just begun. Over the next few days, Keanu made sure to check in with the man, offering what little support he could. He connected him with a local shelter that helped people transition from homelessness, and over time, the man began to open up more, share his story, and find his footing again. It wasn't an easy process. There were setbacks, difficult conversations, and moments when the man felt like giving up. But Keanu was there, not to fix the situation, but to walk alongside him, offering steady support and the reminder that he was worthy of a fresh start. As Keanu continued his journey, he came to understand that sometimes the most profound moments of connection happen in the spaces where no one is watching, where no applause is given, and where the only reward is the quiet knowledge that you've made a difference in someone else's life. These were the moments that changed him, shaped him, and reminded him that the most powerful act of kindness was often the one that went unnoticed by the world. But to those who received it, those silent gifts were everything. The ripple that lasts. Keanu Reeves had always believed that life wasn't about accolades, fame, or the recognition of achievements. Yet over the last several months, something within him had transformed. His quest for meaning, for purpose, had taken him into the quiet, uncelebrated spaces of life, where the truest connections were formed. He had come to realize that kindness wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic acts. It was in the small, quiet moments of human interaction, the ones that might not make the headlines, but could change someone's world. By now, Keanu had found a new rhythm in his life, one that felt more aligned with the person he had always known himself to be, but had never fully embraced. The events of the past months had left an indelible mark on his heart, and with each passing day, he felt more connected to the world around him. He wasn't seeking out these moments. They seemed to find him. Whether it was the woman at the cafe who needed reassurance, the elderly man in the park who just wanted someone to listen, or the man sitting alone on a bench, wondering if anyone cared enough to notice him. These were the moments that mattered. They were the ones that truly defined who Keanu was becoming. One particular afternoon, Keanu found himself sitting in the same park where he had first met the homeless man months ago. It was a place that had become his sanctuary, a space where he could sit in silence and think about all that had unfolded in his life. The trees above him swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly, and the world around him seemed to slow, as if nature itself was inviting him to pause, to reflect. As he sat on the same bench, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed. The man he had helped that day had turned his life around. He had found a shelter, connected with resources to help him regain his independence, and even started working part-time at a local store. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start, one that had been possible only because someone had taken the time to sit next to him, to offer him the simple gift of presence. But it wasn't just that one moment that stood out. Keanu's life had become a series of quiet encounters, each of them leaving him with the understanding that these small acts of compassion, though often invisible to the world, had the power to shift the course of lives. In each conversation, each interaction, he had become more attuned to the power of being present, of truly seeing the people around him, not as strangers or obstacles, but as fellow travelers in this journey called life. As Keanu sat in the park, a soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Mind if I sit here?" Keanu looked up, surprised to see a young woman standing before him. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, her face open and friendly, but there was a certain heaviness in her eyes that Keanu couldn't ignore. She wasn't in a rush, wasn't looking for something. She was simply looking for connection. A small smile played on her lips as she waited for his response. "Not at all," Keanu replied, gesturing to the empty space on the bench beside him. He offered her a welcoming smile, his usual calmness present in his demeanor. She sat down beside him, not immediately speaking, but simply taking in the quiet of the park. Keanu allowed the silence to hang between them, comfortable in the shared space. There was no pressure to fill the air with words, and he knew that sometimes the most healing thing one could offer was just that, quiet, shared space. After a few moments, the young woman spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "I don't usually talk to strangers, but I felt like I needed to today." Keanu nodded, sensing the weight in her words. "I understand," he said gently. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone you don't know." She glanced at him, studying his face for a moment before her eyes softened. "You look familiar," she said, her tone almost unsure, as though she were trying to place him. "I don't mean to be weird, but I think I've seen you on TV." Keanu chuckled lightly, his smile genuine. "I'm not surprised. I do get around in front of cameras sometimes." He paused, letting the conversation flow naturally. "But that's not why you're here, is it?" The young woman looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting together. "No, it's not," she admitted. "I'm just lost, I guess. I don't know where I'm going anymore. I've been fighting my way through life for so long, but nothing seems to make sense anymore. I've always had this feeling that I had to prove something to everyone, my parents, my friends, the world. But now I'm not even sure what I'm trying to prove." Keanu's heart ached for her. He recognized the struggle she was describing, the kind of inner conflict that could drain a person's spirit without them even realizing it. He knew that feeling all too well. He had spent much of his life trying to live up to expectations, his own, others, the world's. But over time, he had learned that the true freedom came not from proving anything, but from letting go of the need to prove it all. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. "We're all just trying to find our way. And sometimes the hardest thing is realizing that you don't have to have all the answers right now. It's okay to not know. It's okay to just be." The young woman's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them back quickly, trying to regain control. "But I've been trying so hard. Everyone around me keeps telling me that I need to keep pushing, keep moving forward. And I don't know how much more I can give." Keanu could see the exhaustion in her face. It was the same weariness he had seen in so many people, people who had given and given, only to find themselves drained, with little left to offer. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze gentle but firm. "You've been pushing because you think you need to keep up with something outside of you," he said. "But what if the answer isn't in the pushing? What if the answer is in allowing yourself to rest, to simply be? To let go of the weight of expectations and give yourself the grace to just be who you are, without apology." For a long time, the young woman didn't say anything. She just sat there, breathing in the air, taking in the words. Keanu allowed the silence to envelop them, knowing that sometimes the most important thing you can do is offer someone space to absorb what they've heard. Eventually, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I don't know if I'm ready to let go of all of it. I don't know if I can. But hearing you say that, it makes me think that maybe I don't have to do it all on my own." Keanu smiled, a warm and reassuring expression. No one has to do it alone. That's the thing we forget sometimes. We're all in this together. It's not about perfection or about getting everything right. It's about being kind to yourself when you fall and knowing that you can get back up, one step at a time. The young woman looked at him, a hint of hope starting to break through the uncertainty in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that." Keanu simply nodded, standing up from the bench. "Take care of yourself," he said gently, his voice carrying the same quiet strength he had shared with so many others. "Remember, you don't need to have all the answers. Just take it one day at a time." As he walked away, Keanu felt a familiar sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what would become of the young woman's journey, or whether the words he had shared with her would make a lasting difference. But that wasn't the point. The point was that, in that moment, he had shared a quiet connection with someone who needed it. And that was enough. The ripple effects of his journey, of the quiet acts of kindness he had offered, were continuing to spread. They weren't loud or flashy, but they were real, and they were changing lives. Keanu knew that this was the true gift of his path, that the smallest moments could have the greatest impact. And as he walked away, he understood that this was what it meant to live with purpose, not in the pursuit of fame, but in the quiet, steady offering of presence, of compassion, and of love.